Opening the center immediately, this pawn thrust promises a dynamic game with immediate diagonal influence. Immediately contest central space, creating a mirror image and setting the stage for open lines. Instantly challenging black's central pawn and preparing to develop the kingside piece, this move aims to seize the initiative and open avenues for future king attacks. An immediate counterattack on the central pawn forces white to defend or face material loss. Opportunistically snatching the pawn, white initiates a sharp tactical battle, though it neglects king's safety somewhat. Defending the knight with this pawn advances piece development and opens lines for future queenside activity. Recapturing develops another knight, intensifying pressure on black's central pawn. Recapturing the pawn opens lines and invites active piece play. Reclaiming central space efficiently after the knight's skirmish, this thrust aims to build a powerful pawn core and restrict black's developing pieces. Centralizing a pawn creates a robust pawn chain, strengthening piece activity and potential for an attack. Developing the bishop to the center bolsters white's central control and prepares for kingside castling, while simultaneously pressuring black's knight and potentially creating a discovered attack later on. Developing the bishop to this square establishes an active piece, eyeing the white king's diagonal and reinforcing the pawn chain. It prepares for castling, a crucial defensive maneuver, while also contributing to central control. This placement creates immediate pressure and forces white to consider defensive arrangements rather than solely focusing on their own attacking ideas. Securing the monarch through castling is a prudent step, preparing to bring a rook into the fray and connect the major pieces, fundamentally improving the king's safety and white's overall piece coordination for the developing struggle. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking him away behind a pawn shield is a natural and instinctive reaction, completing the initial phase of development and preparing for the impending clash of forces. Challenging black's central grip, white immediately opens lines and prepares to seize initiative, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development before the queen's knight can safely reposition. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for queenside expansion, this move anchors black's central presence. Securing the queen behind the pawn chain immediately prepares to challenge black's control of the d5 square and aims to open lines for the c-pawn and potentially the rook, increasing pressure on black's somewhat cramped queenside. Relocating the knight to the queenside seems passive, forfeiting development and hindering central control. Instead, prioritizing piece activity would better challenge white's central pawn structure and developing initiative. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the c-file, this move wisely avoids immediate pawn advances that could weaken the center, instead opting for a more patient approach to development. Pushing the f-pawn opens a daring diagonal for the queen and aims to seize central space, but it significantly weakens the kingside structure and could leave the monarch exposed to future attacks. This aggressive pawn thrust demands careful calculation of tactical consequences and a keen eye for positional imbalances, as the potential for a swift counterattack on the weakened dark squares is considerable. Re-establishing knight presence in the center, NC prepares for potential pawn advances and reinforces the d4 square, creating a more dynamic pawn structure. Establishing the bishop on this diagonal grants immediate influence over the d5 pawn and prepares for potential counterplay on the kingside, while also reinforcing the central structure. A subtle repositioning of the queen, aiming to pry open the queenside and prepare for a potential exchange on d5, while simultaneously discouraging black's nascent queenside pawn push. The knight repositions, aiming to control the vital d5 outpost and potentially support a queenside expansion, though its immediate impact is somewhat passive given the central pawn structure. Securing space on the queenside, by advancing the c-pawn now cramps black's maneuvering potential and prepares to open the queenside for white's pieces. Black solidifies the pawn chain, preparing to potentially challenge white's queenside majority and creating a more robust defensive structure. Snatching the b7 pawn is a bold, almost reckless grab that immediately creates a positional imbalance. While material is gained, the white queen ventures deep into enemy territory, potentially becoming isolated and a target, while white's own king remains somewhat exposed. Black now has a clear opportunity to coordinate pieces and launch a counterattack against this overextended queen and the weakened kingside. Reclaiming material while simultaneously disrupting white's queen is the immediate, forceful purpose of bringing the rook to the b8 square. This action brilliantly counters the queen's intrusion, forcing it to retreat and potentially exposing it further, while also securing the b-file for future operations. It's a testament to Black's understanding that material gain is secondary to maintaining piece activity and controlling key lines. Discarding material for a fleeting attack on the queenside seems ill-advised, especially with your own king still exposed in the center. The ceded space via c5 now becomes a permanent liability, creating a permanent stronghold for Black's pieces and potentially leaving your queen stranded. Consider the geometric implications. The queenside is now dangerously open for Black's reinforcements. Suddenly, the rook finds itself under intense scrutiny, a misplaced piece dancing too close to enemy lines, demanding immediate reassessment of its safety and strategic purpose. Aggressively seizing the queenside outpost with the queen is a bold gambit, gambling on the disruption of Black's coordination. Yet it leaves white's own king momentarily exposed to potential counterthrusts along the now-open central files. Black repositions the rook, the queen's foray to the 7th rank now neutralized by the knight's escape and the subsequent pawn advance. This maneuver, while defensive, surrenders tempo and solidifies white's queenside space advantage, potentially creating future targets along the file. White is aggressively pushing pawns on the queenside, a classic maneuver to gain space and disrupt Black's coordination, but it risks overextending and leaving weaknesses behind, particularly the isolated pawn. The current placement of the queen on a5, while seemingly active, might be vulnerable to Black's potential counterplay on the queenside or even a direct attack on the king if Black can open lines. This aggressive pawn-grabbing strategy often leads to tactical fireworks, and Black must be vigilant for opportunities to exploit white's stretched position. Black's rook, having been pushed all the way to the edge of the board by white's queen, now finds itself in a seemingly passive position, yet it cleverly obstructs the file and denies white immediate infiltration, potentially setting up a later sortie or a defensive maneuver. The queen's retreat here signals a pragmatic retreat from the tactical melee, aiming to re-establish some positional stability, though white has ceded valuable tempo in chasing the rook around the board, which may lead to opportunities for Black to consolidate their position and develop counterplay along the opened files. Reclaiming central influence and preparing a subtle pawn advance, Black aims to solidify their queenside presence while developing the bishop to a more active diagonal. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, seeks to create a stable pawn chain and prevent white from further territorial gains on the queenside. The bishop on f6 eyes the g5 square, potentially a future outpost, and supports the eventual d5 pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure. It's a patient approach, building a solid defensive foundation before embarking on more aggressive ventures. White, by returning the queen to b3, acknowledges the queen's adventurous sortie was a bit premature, seeking a safer haven rather than continuing the chase. This tempo gain allows Black to solidify their defenses and potentially prepare further counterplay on the queenside or center. The position now hinges on whose pawn structure will buckle first under the relentless pressure. Consolidating the bishop to a more defensive posture, this maneuver anticipates potential threats and prepares for the dawning complexities of maneuvering pieces through the constricted central territory. Reorganizing the queen from its active but potentially exposed posting on b3, white seeks to consolidate and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, aiming to create space and restrict Black's minor pieces. Black's knight embarks on a curious patrol to e6, a square that suddenly becomes a nexus of potential conflict, disrupting white's queenly promenade. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, cleverly redirects the pressure, aiming to fortify the queenside and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure. It hints at a deeper plan, a subtle reevaluation of the board's dynamics, perhaps preparing for a future advance on the kingside or a counterthrust through the d-file. Observe how this knight's presence on e6 subtly shifts the balance of forces, creating new targets and defensive considerations for the opponent. A curious repositioning, initiating a gradual realignment that might be aiming to unburden the kingside or perhaps bolster the d4 pawn's defenses, though it does leave the e2 square temporarily vacant. Sensing an opportunity to consolidate her queenside presence, black anchors her queen on c7, preparing to challenge the long diagonal and potentially support a future c5 push, while simultaneously adding a defender to the beleaguered e6 square. Initiating a slow squeeze, this piece repositions to add pressure along the queenside, subtly reinforcing the advance of the c-pawn and preparing to contest the open c-file should it materialize, while also offering a potential exchange that could simplify into a slightly more favorable structure for white. A daring pawn thrust, pushing forward with aggressive intent, aiming to seize space on the kingside and potentially disrupt white's well-organized pieces. This aggressive gesture signals a desire to break open lines and create complications, even at the cost of some pawn structure integrity. It's a clear indication that black is not content to passively defend and seeks active counterplay. Unleashing a knight towards the enemy king's territory, this maneuver injects immediate dynamism, creating a fascinating spatial dilemma for black as the knight eyes the f7 square and the vulnerable pawn chain. A daring pawn thrust, seeking to unravel white's central control and create dynamic counterplay, even at the cost of weakening black's own pawn structure. This aggressive maneuver injects immediate tension, daring white to resolve the immediate threats or risk falling behind in initiative. A strategic reassessment is in order, repositioning the bishop to a more central square where it can eye the kingside flank and potentially support a pawn advance, while simultaneously vacating the diagonal for the knight, aiming to avoid immediate confrontation and prepare for a more nuanced positional struggle. Unleashing a tactical storm, black disrupts white's seemingly solid pawn shield by capturing the knight on d4, aiming to pry open lines and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white monarch. This aggressive thrust forces white into a defensive posture, potentially sacrificing material for initiative, as the queenside pawns are now under considerable strain and the king's shelter might be compromised. The knight's daring capture, a seemingly natural response to the pawn's advance, instantly injects a sharp tactical undertone into this already complex middle game, challenging black's recently fortified structure and opening new avenues for white's pieces. Unleashing a powerful knight sortie, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate tactical complications. This bold exchange sacrifices material for an initiative, forcing white to react defensively to the sudden pressure on their king's vicinity. The bishop's capture on e5 decisively resolves the central pawn structure, opening diagonals and simplifying the position towards a potentially advantageous endgame for white, as black's king appears increasingly exposed and their queenside development remains hampered. The black pawn's advance dramatically reshapes the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn on the d-file but simultaneously opening lines for white's pieces that could prove dangerous if not carefully managed. This capture on e4, while regaining material, opens up a dramatic strategic confrontation. White's queen, now aggressively positioned, faces immediate threats and potential counterplay as black's pieces, particularly the bishop on e7, are poised to exploit the newly created diagonal and pawn structure. Observe how the board's geometry has drastically shifted, presenting both sides with sharp tactical possibilities centered around the vulnerable e4 square and the exposed white king. A bold attempt to untangle the pieces and seek counterplay amidst white's encroaching queenside pawns, though it invites further confrontation in the center. Unleashing a bold queen strike to disrupt black's pawn structure, white aims to create immediate tactical chaos and exploit the centralized king. Injecting immediate pressure onto the d-file, Rad8 seeks to activate the rook and exploit the open column, potentially targeting white's queen or creating threats against the weakened king's flank. Recognizing the blocked queenside, white pivots to attack the kingside's exposed pawns. Unleashing a pawn storm with this aggressive thrust creates immediate chaos, forcing white's pieces onto the defensive and potentially opening lines for your king's assault. Unleashing the pawn chain's potential, white boldly advances, aiming to disrupt black's imposing pawn wall and create an escape route for the king. Black aims to untangle their pieces and initiate counterplay on the queen's side. The pawn push on g5 has created attacking potential, but it has also weakened the kingside structure. The defender of the black monarch now finds itself rather exposed. A crucial decision is brewing regarding the central pawn structure and how black will develop their remaining forces. The immediate threat might be to dislodge white's well-placed pieces. The game has entered a phase where precise maneuvering is paramount, with both sides vying for control of key squares. Reopening the e-file creates a concrete threat of infiltration towards black's somewhat exposed monarch, forcing a defensive reaction. The knight's retreat opens a clear path for the bishop to potentially swing over to the kingside, bolstering the pawn's storm that's brewing and adding pressure on white's vulnerable monarch. Unleashing a potent rook onto the 7th rank, this bold advance injects immediate dynamism, threatening to pierce the heart of black's defenses and create undeniable weaknesses around the exposed king. Unleashing a stunning queen sortie, black injects immediate life into the now exposed white king, turning a potentially passive defense into an aggressive counterattack and demanding white's full attention. Stepping back from immediate threats, the queen regains a crucial defensive square, aiming to solidify the king's sanctuary and perhaps prepare for a more measured defense against black's unleashed pawn storm. Sensing an opportunity for a decisive exchange, black clears the path for a more active queen, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and the potential for a discovered attack down the f-file. The recapture finally stabilizes the center, but white's queenside pawn structure remains a significant long-term liability, potentially leading to an endgame where those doubled pawns become a genuine weakness. Black's intention is to consolidate their pieces, aiming to activate the bishop on c4 and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside, or centralize their pieces further after the exchange of queens. Securing the open d-file with the rook provides an immediate anchor for white's operations, potentially preparing for a coordinated advance of the remaining pawns or a later repositioning of the monarch for safety in the ensuing endgame scenarios. Reigniting the initiative on the kingside with a pawn storm is a bold gamble, seeking to dismantle white's increasingly secure position and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch, though it comes at the cost of potential positional concessions. Seizing the open file offers an immediate tactical advantage, but consider the repercussions for your king's safety in this dynamically balanced scenario. Finally, black forces a decisive exchange, clearing the critical d-file for the rooks and aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king. The abrupt shift to the rook on the 2nd rank opens a dangerous diagonal for black's queen and invites immediate counterplay on the open file, potentially unraveling white's queenside pawn structure. The decisive exchange on e1 is a consequence of the earlier pawn push f4 and the subsequent tactical complications. It simplifies the position into a queenless middle game where white's king's safety might become an issue with black's active pieces. Capturing the bishop solidifies white's material advantage, forcing black into an extremely difficult endgame where every pawn and piece sacrifice will be scrutinized. Capturing the bishop on b2 offers immediate material gain, but it also opens lines and sacrifices valuable defensive coverage around the black king, a risky proposition when white still possesses pieces to exploit those newly exposed weaknesses. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside to contest the open files and potentially create a passed pawn is a proactive, albeit slightly risky, step in this complex endgame scenario, aiming to disrupt black's piece activity and gain counterplay before black's kingside attack solidifies. Focusing on the repositioning of the monarch, this advance aims to shelter the king from any lingering threats on the kingside and potentially prepare for active participation in the upcoming pawn endgame, seeking a safer square to consolidate. Unlocking the queenside pawns for advance, this maneuver seeks to create new attacking avenues by potentially splitting black's defenses. The black bishop abandons its defensive post on d5, seeking activity on the queenside, yet this repositioning might leave the pawn chain on the kingside less adequately supported against white's advancing a pawn. Activating the knight to a central outpost on d4 immediately addresses the weakened light squares around black's king and seeks to disrupt white's harmonious piece play. Embracing the ensuing pawn battle, black proactively rallies their bishop to the center, seeking to disrupt white's recently consolidated queen's side pawn structure and exploit the open lines that will inevitably arise. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential, white finally advances this piece, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and create winning opportunities in the endgame. Exploiting the lax pawn structure, black snatches a pawn on the queen side, aiming to simplify and leverage the material advantage in the looming endgame. Unleashing the bishop to c3 aims to reinforce the pawn on a6, simultaneously creating a potential battery along the c-file, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the king side and preparing for further pawn advances on the queen side. Securing the king behind a wall of pawns is a priority now. As the past, a pawn will soon become a formidable threat. Solidifying the pawn chain opens up avenues for the rook on the reopened a-file. Pushing the king towards the queen side offers a sliver of hope for activity, but risks leaving it exposed in the center as white's advanced pawn on a6 becomes a potent threat. Relocating the knight to f5 aims to solidify white's central control and prepare a potential kingside assault by creating attacking possibilities against black's pawn chain. Exploring the bishop's potential across the newly opened diagonals is paramount now. The piece aims to become active by potentially harassing the rook on e1 or even preparing to swing over to the queen side to support the passed pawn. Establishing dominion over the open a-file now becomes paramount for white, aiming to penetrate black's weakened queenside structure and create further instability. Snapping up the pawn immediately might seem tempting, but it overlooks the deeper positional play now unfolding. This capture opens up a vital diagonal for white's bishop, potentially creating threats against the now exposed black king, and it might well lead to a more active endgame for white's pieces if they can coordinate effectively. The bishop's retreat suddenly creates an unexpected fork, threatening to dismantle black's pawn shield and expose their king. The bishop seeks refuge on its own color complex, hoping to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and perhaps offer some counterplay by eyeing that isolated a pawn. Asserting dominion over the queenside pawn chain becomes the immediate priority. The king, finally feeling a breath of fresh air, ventures out to the center, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame. Unleashing the bishop to its intended diagonal, this repositioning aims to finally crack open the long-standing tension on the queen side and exploit the potential weakness created by black's pawn storm. Trading off the bishop here opens up the a-file for the rook and allows the king to become more active by unblocking the pawn structure on the queen side. Re-establishing central control becomes paramount as the knight returns to its accustomed square, aiming to solidify white's position amidst the ensuing pawn structure. The king boldly ventures into the center, a daring assertion of presence amidst the weakened pawn structure, aiming to become a more active participant in the unfolding endgame. Securing the monarch amid the emerging pawn structure and potential threats from the bishop on c4 is paramount now. The king's journey begins, venturing into the heart of the board to seek out cooperative partners among the remaining pawns, a bold maneuver aiming to leverage its newfound mobility before the opposing knight can fully solidify its influence. The monarch abandons its secure position, stepping out into a more exposed, yet potentially active square. Initiating a pawn thrust with the c-pawn, black aims to break open lines and create potential mating threats against white's somewhat exposed king, forcing a decisive engagement in this late middle game stage. Unleashing a decisive check, this knight maneuver shatters the delicate balance on the board, forcing black's king into a precarious corner. A bold foray from the king, seeking a more active role and potentially disrupting white's coordinated pieces despite the inherent risks. Stepping in with the knight to check forces the black king out into a more exposed position, aiming to capitalize on the open files and weakened pawn structure. The monarch makes a bold dash towards the enemy camp, a dangerous gambit to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize the initiative on the queen side. This knight's journey to d1 appears to be a strategic repositioning, aiming to support a central pawn push or perhaps prepare for a diagonal attack on the king side. The knight vacates the d-file, potentially opening it for the rook should it return, and also relinquishes its pressure on c5, a concession that might be necessary to consolidate other pieces. It's a quiet maneuver, but it signals a potential shift in the game's focus from the current pawn structure to a more dynamic piece play. Pushing the c-pawn forward now is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it severely weakens the king's defenses and opens a path for the white knight to infiltrate. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount now, as the monarch ventures into contested territory with the advancing pawn threatening to break through. A crucial repositioning of the bishop, shifting it from its passive outpost to actively block the advancing white pawn and prepare for potential counterplay down the semi-open c-file, should the opportunity arise. Activating the king is paramount now, pushing it forward to contest the central squares and support the pawn advances. The bishop retreats, not to defend the pawn, but to eye the d-file and potentially reinforce the queenside majority should the king venture too far. The knight hops to its new square, aiming to dominate the central squares and prepare for a potential pawn advance or a decisive king hunt. A desperate gambit to inject chaos, hoping white's meticulously constructed pawn chain falters under the sudden onslaught. Building a central pawn wall offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to stifle black's advancing spearhead. The pawn's advance to e4 significantly constricts white's defensive setup, aiming to pry open lines and potentially trap the black king. Pushing the h-pawn offers a new avenue to advance the king's safety and potentially open lines for your remaining rook, creating a dynamic threat. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and force a critical decision, potentially creating a passed threat. Exploiting the exposed black king, the knight decisively captures, initiating a force sequence that aims to liberate the queen and drive towards a swift conclusion. Suddenly, the pawn chain has fragmented, leaving the king side vulnerable and opening a diagonal for the bishop. Unleashing the pawn to disrupt black's central control and create a formidable passed threat. Securing the pawn's advance while simultaneously creating a potential fortress for the monarch is a key strategic consideration now. Securing the passed pawn now offers a direct path to promotion and a decisive material advantage, simplifying the path to victory significantly. Securing the pawn with the king allows for eventual pawn pushes and opens up avenues for counterplay, a crucial step when facing an exposed monarch. The king ventures bravely forward, aiming to connect with the pawns and prepare for their final push towards promotion. The bishop's discovery of the king, forcing it from its secure corner, opens a path for potential counterplay, despite the material disadvantage. The monarch shuffles sideways, seeking refuge behind a pawn, but the encroaching pawns on the queen side now present a serious threat, potentially breaking through to the promotion square. The bishop tucks back, reinforcing the central pawn chain's stability while keeping an eye on the dark squares around white's king, a crucial defensive posture in this tense endgame. Unleashing a final pawn offensive, this move aims to break open lines and exploit the awkward placement of black's king, potentially leading to a forced checkmate or significant material gain by creating an unstoppable passed pawn. The king's promenade towards the queen side, a bold gamble to disrupt white's pawn structure, now faces a reckoning as the knight's advance threatens to sever escape routes and coordinate with its distant counterpart for a decisive blow. This pawn thrust finally aims to unleash the potential of the g-pawn, transforming it into a formidable passed pawn and a serious threat to black's king's safety. The king's journey to the queen side, seeking refuge and potential counterplay, now faces a stark reality. White's advanced pawn on g7 is a looming threat, and black's own king feels exposed amidst the fragmented pawn structure.